Bonding, attunement, and attachment. This is the first PowerPoint in the integrative psychology this week, early life events. So in this section, I am going to be talking about bonding, attunement, and attachment, including the attachment styles, the concept of separation individuation, which I know has been brought up in previous PowerPoints, but it is always worth another look. We'll also touch on the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and in the following PowerPoint, I will be discussing the polyvagal theory as it relates to the topic of these early developments and later life health. As I go through these PowerPoints, I really want to make a point that what I am going to speak on isn't an indictment or accusation or any kind of blame toward any parent or caregiver that has or have had a child with behavioral issues. I want to go on the record to say that parenting is a difficult job, and as a society, we do not give caregivers enough support or acknowledgement, and there are situations where bonding, attunement, and attachment gets disrupted through no fault of the parent or caregiver. And lastly, I mentioned in a previous PowerPoint about rupture and repair. There is also something that's called earned attachment. If there was relational trauma in a person's early life, repair is possible. I want you to all remember that not all is lost. To begin in bonding, attunement, and attachment, I will be talking about bonding, which is the seeking of proximity for safety. When we are born, we are hardwired for connection. If that is not reciprocated, we will likely die. There is a condition that's called failure to thrive, which can be related to a lack of bonding, attunement, and connection. I will also talk about some of the diagnoses that are related to feeding disorders that are part of failure to thrive in a later PowerPoint. So primarily here, we're talking about engagement of our primary caregivers. Children attempt to keep our primary caregivers engaged as a way to ensure safety and survival. If a caregiver is distracted or otherwise ignores the child when they attempt to make a connection through cooing, crying, or other external actions, the child then sort of amps up the actions in a form of protest. It's sort of like, hey, I need something. There is literally no other way for a newborn to indicate a need. So this begins the process of training or teaching the child's nervous system how to get their needs met. So if the need is met appropriately by the caregiver, the connection is made between the internal sensation that drives the need and the internal sensation of that need being met. If the need is not met appropriately and the protest is met with punishment or disapproval or being ignored, it further sends the message that the need is bad, unworthy, or somehow not valid. What ends up happening then is the child tries another method to get the need met. More protest, shut down, even adaptations as another way to get the caregiver's attention. So this kind of leads us into attunement. This is about environmental responsiveness. So the environment, being the caregiver, when they are attuned to the child's needs, this begins the process of training the child's nervous system to connect the inner impulse with a matching response. Now, I know that this back and forth is not 100%. If the need is met appropriately, more often than not, the child begins to learn to recognize their own inner workings over time. You may have heard the term good enough mother, which was a term that is coined by British pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. This phrase is about the initial devotion the primary caregiver has toward the child to fulfill all the child's needs, often sacrificing their own needs. As the child grows, the parent begins to be less responsive to the child's protests, not out of not caring or a lack of empathy, but perhaps exhaustion, or even a recognition that the need isn't life-threatening. So the child then feels some frustration, which is actually a good thing, according to Winnicott. This is part of cognitive development and learning a healthy concept of the external world. When a parent fails to create this beginning bit of separation, there can be psychological consequences that will be discussed in a later PowerPoint. So the interaction with our primary caregivers, allows us a healthy development both physically and mentally, and it really depends upon our interaction with those in our immediate environment, especially those that are our primary caregivers. Now, when we talk about attachment, this is engagement for survival. So regardless of the way that this is expressed, survival is the ultimate purpose. The relational experiences in early life influence later life behavior. The outcome is dependent upon the quality and character of the early attachment figures. The way we are interacted with in those early days, weeks, and months creates an internal working model for how to survive the world. Each attachment style or behavior pattern represents the internalized survival strategy. So remember, a person's externally expressed behavior may not make sense to those around them, but it makes sense internally on some unconscious level. I spoke briefly about the origins of attachment theory in an earlier PowerPoint. I will go in a bit more in depth here. Something to keep in mind is that these are not cut and dried. Often children's behavior can fit one or more of the categories simultaneously. So talking about attachment styles. These are adaptations to the environment in which the child is raised. So the first is the secure attachment. This, of course, is the healthiest expression of the attachment styles. And this style represents safety and security with a child's internal knowing that the parent or primary caregiver is a source of support, caring, and understanding when the child is distressed or upset. The caregiver is responsive and reliable, allowing the child to develop an internal working model of the self that feels loved, lovable, and loving. This is consistency of responsiveness on the part of the caregiver. The child is able to then depend upon the parent or caregiver to provide protection and comfort without shame or guilt or distortion of the need. Avoidant patterns of attachment are created through caregiving that feels rejecting and controlling. When a child displays distress, there is rejection by the caregiver in the way of expressed annoyance or agitation. There may be dismissal or rebuke or irritable attempts to manage, control, deny, or dismiss the child's need. The caregiver fails to respond appropriately to the child's attempts to connect or attach. The response on the child's part is to adapt to the environment as a way to get their needs met. And this is done through the development of strategies, things like minimizing overt displays of affection or even negative affect. The child maintains proximity to the caregiver by appearing not to need anything. The parent and ultimately others see the child as okay when in fact they are in distress. There is a pervasive internal state of arousal and anxiety and an internal working model of being unloved and unlovable, but externally appears to be highly capable and independent. I often call this independence by default. This is someone whose emotions are overregulated. In anxious, also known as ambivalent attachment style, the experience of children raised with caregivers who are insensitive, unreliable, and inconsistently responsive. It results in behaviors that are exaggerated and appear to be overplayed. This adaptation increases the chances that the caregiver will respond. This can be expressed as emotional underregulation. It does not take much to upset a person with ambivalent attachment styles. The external behavior may be experienced as whiny or needy, clingy, or overly dramatic. The internal working model and dialogue is one of low self-worth, ineffectiveness, and being overly dependent. Their experience is that other people are insensitive, neglectful, unpredictable, and unreliable. The child with this type of attachment style may believe that they are unable to make it on their own, that they have no inherent value without the help of others. Now, the third is known as disorganized attachment. The other three, as odd as this may sound, are actually considered to be organized attachment styles. So disorganized is the result of the most inconsistent parenting, where the child finds no way to be soothed or calm in the face of distress. The parent is the source of danger, but because humans are wired to connect, the urge to reach out is still there. The caregiver is often abusive or emotionally unavailable because of their own mental health issues or chemical dependency. The parent consistently fails to protect the child either through direct abuse or negligence, leaving the child in a chronically fearful state. No matter what attachment strategies a child uses to gain proximity to the caregiver, it fails. The external expression of internal distress may be one of anger, confusion, apprehension, or incoherence that can often result in a freeze response. The internal working model is one of fright. The self feels alone, ignored, dangerous, and even bad. The world is experienced as unpredictable, unavailable, confusing, and generally frightening. Remember that these behavioral patterns show up most prominently during times of distress. A child can appear as securely attached, but when they are stressed, they display behaviors that appear disorganized. Now, there have been some studies that have been done that show parenting styles are a direct result of the parent's experience in their own childhood. So this is kind of where we then get into some generational issues. I do want to point out four videos here that you can either click on here or they will be on the main page. Strange Situation is a study that was designed by Mary Ainsworth and used to determine child's attachment styles. Mom Talks to Baby is just a representation of attunement between mom and baby. I think she's speaking Portuguese. And Attachment or Attunement is a short video that describes these two important developmental pieces. And finally, the Still-Faced Experiment shows a baby's response to being ignored. I do want to assure you that no babies were harmed in the making of any of these videos, so they shouldn't cause too much distress. So talking about the neurological consequences, these are expressed cognitively and physiologically in behaviors and external expressions, as well as the internal felt sense of self. With attunement and reciprocity, this is between the primary caregiver and child, allowing for mutual awareness, turn-taking, and emotional resonance. When we talk about the self, when the child feels felt and understood, their internal state is one that is open to exploration and freedom to learn. As they grow, there is increased connection and understanding between what is felt and what is expressed in words and actions. When we talk about emotional regulation, as the parent or primary caregiver synchronizes with and connects to the child's inner world, there is increased levels of internal organization and integration of neural networks, thereby creating the ability to self-regulate and self-soothe. Those things that are age appropriate, knowing that each one of these levels builds upon the foundation of the previous stage. So those stages are appropriate attunement throughout development that creates greater possibility of healthy neural growth, neural coherence, and secure attachment. So the newborn, when the parent and caregiver behavior at this stage includes stroking, cuddling, calm attention, attending to needs with empathic awareness. A toddler at this stage, there's healthy attunement is about creating safe and healthy boundaries around sharing and what constitutes age-appropriate consequences of socially destructive or even unacceptable behavior. Adolescents need more space to explore social roles and responsibilities while being helped with goal-directed and focused behaviors for future success. So when we talk about cultural implications, Mary Ainsworth, who studied with John Bowlby, the one who really was first to talk about and created attachment theory, Mary Ainsworth worked in Uganda. She did some studies in the 1960s and 70s where she studied parent-child interactions in a very distinct tribe. And then since then, several studies have been done with other cultures in other countries that have shown attachment behavior is actually universal. So globally, we talk about secure attachment, which is a style that predominates around the world. But all types of avoidant and ambivalent attachment styles have been found in all cultures globally. There are expectations across cultures that vary socially and interpersonally, which makes a lot of sense because children adapt to the environment in which they are raised. Socioeconomic differences are present around the world, with populations experiencing greater levels of poverty and environmental deprivation. They will then experience more stress overall, thereby displaying higher levels of insecure attachment. So this also makes sense, since the economic insecurity comes with issues of safety and general life security. Now, when we talk about resilience, it is important to remember that harsh conditions, poverty, or otherwise low socioeconomic status does not mean automatically negative attachment styles. In fact, those that have studied disadvantaged populations note that there are surprising high numbers of securely attached children and adults. Moving on to separation and individuation. I know that I have spoke about Margaret Mahler in previous PowerPoints. Remember, she is the one that's responsible for a great deal of seminal work in the field of separation and individuation. So separation and individuation is really about healthy bonding, attunement, and attachment, which leads to that healthy separation and individuation. So what Margaret Mahler kind of really worked on the most was this early childhood, recognizing that there is no separation or distinction between parent and self. We learn in a state of connection with those that have ideally reached their own milestones in a healthy manner. If not, the dysfunction likely gets passed on. So when we talk about separation, this is really the development of limits. When humans are allowed age-appropriate freedoms, then we learn healthy boundaries and the consequences of not respecting those limits. Individuation is the development of the self, and as we are taught and develop a healthy sense of self and a strong internal working model through bonding and attunement, we develop the ability to handle upset in a manner that is not destructive to self or others. Now, I've brought up Masterson before. He is the one that created a great deal of awareness around what happens psychologically when the parent or caregiver is themselves dysregulated, how that can contribute to mental health challenges, primarily in the category of what is known as borderline personality disorder. So Masterson talks about object relations, and remember, I talked about this as well. Object relations is about the ability to see a separate self and other, and functioning from a place of healthy individuated persona. Now, Roru and Woru can appear on the surface as being the same, but there are some very subtle differences. So with Roru, which is rewarding object relational unit, it's characterized by a caregiver that is loving, approving, and supportive of both regressive and clinging tendencies. So the internal self-image is of being a good and compliant and passive child. The linking affect is of feeling good and being gratified, which is kind of linked to a pathological ego, and stimulating the wish for reunion, for reconnection and closeness with the primary caregiver. So Masterson empathically stated that the emotional upheaval experienced by a withdrawing or punishing caregiver cannot be truly articulated in technical terms, and defenses should be viewed as desperate inherent survival strategies against unthinkable anxieties and affect storms, or things like activated behaviors, especially during separation stresses or an individuation striving and stressors. Kind of connected back to what I was talking about earlier. In Woru, this is the withdrawing object relational unit. The object representation is one of a parental part, which is expressed as critical, hostile, angry, or rejecting. Subtly, and at times not so subtly, the child experienced a withdrawing of support and connection when they asserted the wish for separation and individuation. The inner self then experiences feelings of inadequacy, helplessness, guilt, and emptiness. The linking affect is frustration, chronic anger, and resentment that masks underlying depression related to feelings of having been abandoned. So one of the most important things in all of this to remember is that we will make adaptations in order to stay connected. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which has been brought up before, and I'm assuming that several of you, if not all of you, have heard of this. This was a study that was conducted originally in the 1990s. The two primary investigators were Felitti and Anda. This was conducted at Kaiser Permanente Hospital Systems in Southern California, and it actually began as a weight loss study. There initially were 17,000 participants, and it truly kicked off a culture of understanding. Now, what ended up happening was that people that were participants in this original weight loss study lost weight, or they dropped out of the study. And then when they came back for follow-up visits, maybe another health check, annual exam, whatever, it had been found that they had gained back most or all or more of the weight that they had originally lost. And so what ended up happening is that the Felitti and Anda and others began to wonder about why that might have been so. So what they discovered eventually, it came up that this study, the ACEs study, is a 10-question study, and it has been shown to bridge the gap between early events and later life physical health. There is a video that you can click on here or watch through the learning module that will give you just a brief overview again of the study and how this connects. And we'll be speaking more about some of these physical health issues in a later PowerPoint. The earliest experiences and how this relates to psychological development includes those things that constitute trauma, both direct, as in physical, sexual, or psychological abuse, as well as neglect. So abuse is those things that happen to you, and neglect is about what ended up getting missed. This really kind of comes down to dysregulation of primary caregivers. As I stated earlier, when our primary caregivers have unresolved psychological and developmental issues, this does and will get passed down, often being downplayed in statements like, "That's just the way our family is," or "It was good enough for me, it's good enough for my kid," or "Yeah, I got abused, but I turned out okay." This can result in generational issues, behaviors, attitudes, actions that get passed down unless and until someone makes a conscious decision to change or someone steps in and intervenes. So when we talk about unresolved trauma, it is demonstrated in the original ACEs study and subsequent studies that are similar in nature when those things go unhealed. I want to also point out that there is a link to the original ACEs study that you can go ahead and read that. It's part of the learning. So we talk about parents, and these are things like familial patterns, generational traumas, things like substance abuse, incarceration, interpersonal violence. There are social issues, culturally sanctioned ways of behaving, including social policies, but also things like internalized traumas that appear to be cultural ways of behaving, but actually have their roots in treatment that can only be described as traumatic. Things like systemic racism, environmental and economic poverty, and I'll cover these more in the module on cultural and social psychology. There are also unavoidable events. So these are often single events that alter a person's life in unimaginable ways. Things like natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, typhoons, so-called acts of God. There are things like death. So if a child's primary caregiver's primary source of support passes away unexpectedly or even expectedly, this can create a rupture in the availability of that caregiver. This is through no fault of theirs, and the unintended consequences can be devastating. And then surgery. So how do you explain to a newborn that they need to have surgery, or that their primary caregiver needs to have some kind of surgery? A life-saving operation or hospitalization can create relational rupture that must be addressed as soon as possible. There are unintentional and intentional events. So abuse, as I spoke of earlier, abuse are those things that happen to us that cause damage during psychological development. This can be a single event or something that happens over an extended period of time. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, and even intentional psychological abuse. And then there's neglect. So those are the things that got missed and often create the most confusion for both the developing child and an adult exploring themselves in therapy. It's the, why do I feel so bad when we had food in the refrigerator, a roof over our head, and clothes on our back? Statements that may cover up the emotionally or psychologically unresponsive parent, the failure of the primary caregiver to meet the developing child's earliest needs related to bonding and attunement. So those early life events lay the foundation for how we react and respond. We learn to adapt, and this may look like bad behavior on the outside, but it makes sense in context. To sum everything up, those early life events shape who we become. The interactions with our primary caregivers in our earliest hours, days, weeks, and months are important for laying the foundation of later life expressions, both with ourselves and those around us. The attachment styles can affect our psychological development. Healthy and consistent interactions allow for a calm internal working model of self and the world, which allows for curiosity and exploration and the development of healthy boundaries and a healthy sense of self. Patterns get established during development can persist. When those behaviors are passed down, they can set the stage of negative cognitions, emotional affect, both internal representations of self and others. The adaptations are those things that we do to help us survive. They serve us in childhood, but they can become harmful or even dangerous later in life. And of course, here are your references.